friends, welcome back to my channel. I am so excited to be making today's video for so many reasons. One of those reasons being that you're going to be getting 2 full stories in today's video. I'm also so excited because I've been receiving such positive feedback from my new series, and I'm excited for episode number 3. I also love that today feels so October-y. I know October is not even a word, but I think I'm inventing it right now. It's been just so stormy, rainy, gray, like a typical perfect October day. So why not kick off episode 3 today? So story number 1 that I'm going to be sharing with you guys today retells the time that my aunt experienced a ghostly presence in the middle of the night on the 4th floor of our haunted Victorian era home. And for story number 2 today, I'll be telling the time that my grandfather experienced someone calling his name in a garage where someone had formerly died on the property of our home. And just a side note before we get into our stories today, if you haven't hit that subscribe button below, make sure you do that so you can be alerted anytime I post. While you're checking out my page, be sure to leave a comment below. Alright, so let's get into it. So story number 1 begins back when I was probably around 6 or 7 years old. So as you guys know, if you've seen my last 2 episodes, I shared my summer house with a ton of my family members. We shared it with my entire father's side of the family, so we had a lot of people in our home. So this story takes place before my aunt and my uncle were even married. It was when they had first started dating each other, and this was the very first time that my aunt was coming to visit our 1865 Victorian home. So just to preface, my aunt was not a very skittish person. She really didn't know much about the history of the house when she had come over. She went in not knowing much. So on the very first weekend when she had come to visit our family home, we planned to stay through to the weekend, which was what most of us did because it was about an hour and 15-minute ride away from the city. So we planned to make a whole weekend out of the trip. So on the Friday night when she had arrived to our home, a bunch of our family members were there. We were so excited to meet my uncle's new girlfriend, and it was just a very fun family event. So we all hung out at the house together, we had dinner together, and then later that night we were just kind of relaxing, sitting around the dinner table talking about stories and catching up with each other. So as all of our family members are just sitting at the table talking about things, the topic of conversation moves to our home. My aunt was asking questions because she really wanted to understand the history, and she kind of was wowed by the way that the home looked. And so everyone was filling my aunt in on all of the stories and tales that had been passed down, and we wound up sitting around the table in the kitchen for a very long time for the rest of that night, just telling ghost stories. We told the story of the piano player who had passed out and died at the piano while he was entertaining the guests of the hotel. We told my aunt the story about the time that the people who used to own the house before us encountered the ghost on the landing of the staircase. We told her quite a few stories, and she was a true sport. She sat there, she had a great time. So my family wasn't trying to creep my aunt out. We weren't trying to spook her. We were just telling our truth of what we know the house to be and the house's history. And trust me, there was a lot. So it began to get late, and everyone decided that it was time to retire to our bedrooms and go to sleep for the night. It was well after midnight. We had stayed there for a very long time. Now, just remember that since the house was so old and the way that it was built in 1865, it was a very dark house. There were a lot of dark hallways and dark corners, so the house was very dark, especially during the nighttime. So if you recall, my aunt and my uncle had just started dating at this point. They weren't married, so they decided to sleep in separate bedrooms. So right before my uncle and my aunt headed to bed, my uncle had said some kind of funny remark, something along the lines of, hey, you know, if the ghost visits you in the middle of the night, tell him I said hi. And she just laughed it off because, like I said, she's not a very skittish type of person. It was all in fun and games. It wasn't supposed to be scary to her, and it didn't really bother her. Each of them headed to their separate quarters on the 4th floor. So now the thing about the 4th floor was that most of the time it was uninhabited. Nobody really slept up there. Most of the bedrooms were on the 3rd floor. And I remember as a child just always being very creeped by the 4th and the 5th floor. Maybe because nobody was ever really up there. It was very isolated, very alone from the rest of the house. It was very creepy up on that 4th floor with nothing to do, no cell phones at the time, nothing to kind of distract yourself. So being that it was late, my aunt decided to go to bed, as did my uncle. So both of them headed to their bedrooms, unpacked, and settled in and got themselves comfortable. So the room where my aunt was staying, it's very important for me to paint a picture for you guys of how the room was set up. So if you walked into the room, there was a crescent-shaped window on the far end of the room, opposite of where the hallway was. The bed was in the center of that room. Now where the hallway and the door were, led into a large hallway common area, and I'll insert some pictures. So the room connected to a very large open space on the 4th floor. So my aunt laid in the bed that was placed in the center of the room, facing the far end of the room toward the window, which meant her back was facing the door into the hallway. So my aunt decided to leave the bedroom door open so that she could hear my uncle in the room down the hall from her and just kind of gauge where he was at throughout the night. So as my aunt is laying in her bed in the still of night, in the dead silence, she starts to hear the sound of somebody slowly walking toward her bed. I mean, she was audibly able to hear the footsteps slowly creeping up behind her. So she sits there for a moment and listens, and she hears the footsteps getting closer and closer and closer. So now my aunt fully believes that this is my uncle standing at the edge of her bed, trying to spook her, trying to creep her out with the remark that he said before they went to bed and all of the stories that they were telling her. She fully thinks that it's him. So in this moment, my aunt decides that she's not gonna let my uncle scare her, that she's gonna be one step ahead of him, and that she's gonna let him come to the edge of her bed, and then before he's able to scare her, she's gonna be the one to spook him first. So in the silence, my aunt just waits there and listens. She listens to the footsteps slowly approaching the bed. The whole time she's just laying there pretending to be asleep, not moving, not flinching at all. She hears the footsteps finally approaching her bed, and she knows that this is her moment, and she's ready to turn around and scare my uncle before he's able to scare her. So the footsteps stop, and she knows that he's standing right beside her. So she turns around and yells, "Boo!" And what she's greeted with is an entirely empty bedroom. My uncle was nowhere to be found. He wasn't standing at the side of the bed, and she has no idea what's going on at this point. So now she's startled. She sits up in bed and runs out down the hallway over to the bedroom where my uncle is. And what does she see? In his bedroom, he is sound asleep. So she knows that there was no way that it was my uncle creeping up behind her. Now in this moment, my aunt absolutely freaks out and loses it and wakes up my uncle and says, "Were you trying to scare me?" And of course, he has no idea what was going on because he was in La La Land. So P.S. she comes to find out that it was not him, and the only explanation for the footsteps that crept up to the edge of her bed was that she had a visitor come and see her very first night staying in the house. So the next morning at breakfast, we were all gathered in the kitchen as we normally did, and my aunt shared with us a very, very terrifying story of her experience the night before. And to this day, I think it's one of the spookiest stories that we do have from that house. So now moving on to story number 2. Story number 2 is one that I hold kind of near and dear to my heart because my grandfather is no longer with us, but I think this is another one of the most insane stories, and I cannot explain it to this day. So when my grandfather was alive, him and my grandmother would stay in the summer house very often. They normally lived in Florida, and what they did during the summer was that they would leave Florida and come stay at the house, enjoy seeing their family because we all had off from school, so we were able to come down there more often than we were able to in the winter time. So it was a great time for everyone to be able to see each other, a great meeting spot, and it brought the family together. So being that all the parents had to work during the week, we would try and go up there on weekends. So my grandparents were so traditional. My grandmother would be in the kitchen cooking dinner for him, just making sure that he had everything he needed and wanted, and they had such an amazing relationship that I value so deeply. And growing up, I always knew I wanted to marry someone and have a relationship that was as loving as my grandparents' one was. So for a majority of the time, my grandparents were in the house together, just the two of them. So as my grandfather had begun to age, he developed some sort of complications with his health, and so from time to time, my grandfather would pass out or have seizures. He was having these episodes where I'd say every few months it would happen when there was an episode where he wasn't feeling well and he would pass out. So one summer evening, my grandmother was in the kitchen cooking dinner for my grandfather. Now, we had a huge garage at our house, and it was a space where we stored a lot of things, but it was also my grandfather's workspace as well. He had all his tools in there, and he would spend quite a decent amount of time in the garage. So now I want to show you guys how far apart the kitchen is from where the garage is. They are on exact opposite ends of the home. So being that the kitchen was so far apart from the garage, there was no way that anyone would be able to hear if someone was calling them, or it was just they were so far apart and so separated from each other. So as my grandmother was preparing dinner in the kitchen, my grandfather decided to go out to the garage to finish up some odds and ends that he was doing. So now, like I said, the garage was a very big space, and it was a pretty dark space as well. There was a door on the left-hand side that you could enter in the garage through, or you could open up the garage door to enter it. So my grandfather was in the garage by himself, which was nothing out of the ordinary. So now we're gonna pause and we're gonna rewind a little bit so that I could share with you guys some of the history of the house in the garage specifically. So in 1865, when the house was built, the original owner took such pride of his home. And from what I've heard, the garage was also the space that the man who built the home had absolutely loved. He had used it as an area where he stored his cars. I'm not sure if he was a mechanic, but I do know that he was always in the garage working on cars, and it was a passion of his, which is why he had such a large garage built in the first place. Now, this story takes a very unfortunate turn because the original owner of the house was in the garage one day and he had the car lifted up on a jack. Unfortunately, the jack gave way and the car crushed the original owner of the house while he was underneath fixing it. He was instantly killed, and it's just very upsetting to know that in the one place he loved, he met his demise doing something that was his passion. And it is a factual story that this happened, and it's a part of the history of the home. So now let's fast forward back to my grandfather on that summer evening in the garage by himself. So my grandfather's out there tidying up, and all of a sudden he starts to not feel well. He knows one of those episodes are coming on, and he starts to feel extremely faint, and he knows that he's most likely going to pass out. So he starts lowering himself closer to the ground so that he didn't fall and injure himself or hit his head and really just get hurt in the process of going down. So he starts to fall, and eventually he does pass out. So my grandfather is now in the garage by himself. He's unconscious at this point. So he's just lying there, unaware of what's going on around him. When you're in that state, you start to kind of make your way out of it, but you're not fully back to your normal self, but you can kind of hear what's going on around you. So my grandfather starts to come to, but he remains on the floor lying there. And as he's in this twilight state where he can hear what's going on around him, but he's not necessarily able to move yet, he hears somebody calling his name. He hears somebody standing next to him in the garage whispering, "Tony, Tony, Tony, get up, get up." So my grandfather is just still lying there. He's unable to move, but this kind of snaps him up out of the state that he's in, and he now knows that he has to get up. He now knows and realizes that he's on the floor. So he hears this voice continuing to call him, continuing to tell him to get up off the floor. And he opens up his eyes and he looks around the garage, and there is nobody there with him. So once he started to come to, he was able to get up, and he stood up and collected himself, and then he left the garage and walked over to the kitchen. And he sees my grandmother just standing there, and she has no idea this whole episode that has happened while she's been in there cooking dinner. And now he's just extremely confused because he knows that he heard somebody calling him and telling him to get up off the floor. And he says to my grandmother, "Were you in the garage with me?" And she turns around and she was startled and she had no idea what he was talking about. And then my grandfather begins to explain what had actually happened to him within the last few minutes in the garage, and how he had passed out and how he had heard somebody telling him to get up off the floor. And my grandmother stood there to her disbelief, and she was trying to figure out what on earth could have happened or who it could have been. And to this day, nobody actually has been able to say who it was that was telling my grandfather to get off the floor. But the only assumption that we could make was that it was possibly the original owner of the home in his garage, in his sanctuary, trying to look after the family that now inhabited his home and make sure that my grandfather was okay. And we would be so thankful if that was the case and if that was him and he was just trying to look out for his home and the people in it. And it's just such a crazy story because my grandparents were so traditional and they didn't believe in ghosts and they didn't believe in anything supernatural or paranormal. And just hearing this story, how could you not believe? And I think the two of them decided that that would be a turning point, and that there was no denying the fact that somebody was in the garage with my grandfather that day trying to help him. I hope you guys enjoyed both of the stories that I shared with you today. I'm so excited to continue making a ton more of these videos. I just feel like since Halloween is my absolute favorite holiday, I have to take advantage and I have to keep making as many more of these episodes as I possibly can before Halloween comes and goes like it always does. So I'm gonna take full advantage and continue to make more videos for you guys. Thank you so much for the positivity, and I am so excited to continue doing this. I hope you guys enjoyed today's video, and if you did, go ahead and comment below if you've had any kind of similar crazy experiences like that. I would love to know. Thank you guys so much for watching, and until next time.